The oil was slicked across his leather glove, a thin, acrid film that tasted faintly of ozone and pulverized metal, residue from the shattered plexiglass canopy of the leading lady. The fortress that had flown on their left wing just minutes ago, now only a spiraling bonfire of aluminum and human despair a mile below in the frozen wastes of Saxony. Lieutenant Colonel Chet Harmon clenched his jaw until the bone popped, the vibration of the four mighty Wright Cyclones in his B-17G, Iron Maiden, doing little to settle the sickening churn in his stomach. It was October 1943, and every mile deep into the Reich felt like wading through glass shards. The air was thick with desperation, not just from the Germans throwing everything they had at the bomb groups, but from the grim realization sinking into the minds of the American bomber crews. They were fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win alone. They were the spearhead, yet they were fundamentally unprotected. Today's target, the ball-bearing factories near Schweinfurt, was vital, absolutely vital, the intelligence officers had stressed, but the cost was staggering. Look left, empty sky. Look right. A fortress trailing thick, black oil smoke, struggling desperately to hold formation while the remaining 11 members of the High Squadron watched with sick resignation, knowing that plane was living on borrowed time. The Messerschmitts, particularly the heavy FW-190s of JG-26, were utterly relentless. They were not pilots. They were executioners, slicing through the tight box formations, flying almost wingtip to wingtip with the bombers, unleashing torrents of 20mm cannon fire that could rip open a wing fuel tank or sever control cables in a single terrifying pass. Chet remembered the pre-mission briefing, the confident lines drawn on the map, the reassurances that fighter escort, though limited, would carry them beyond Aachen. But Aachen had faded hours ago into the smog of occupied Europe, and the little P-47 Thunderbolts, stout fighters though they were, simply didn't possess the fuel capacity to follow the flying fortresses to their deepest, most crucial targets. The distance was the enemy's greatest ally. It allowed the Luftwaffe, battered but not broken, to cycle reserves, refuel, and attack with methodical, terrifying efficiency, knowing that for every American bomber they shot down, the strategic weight of the entire campaign faltered. That day, they lost 60 planes, 60 fortresses, 600 men, vanished from the formations, leaving behind only the ghost contrails and the knowledge that something fundamental had to change. The 8th Air Force was being bled white, their bravery a tragic monument to a flawed deep strike strategy. The High Command knew it. The men flying the missions knew it. If they didn't find a way to reach Berlin and beyond, not just with bombs but with the steel umbrella of fighter protection, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse under the weight of its own casualties. The deep-seated, marrow-freezing fear that permeated the formations in those dark months was the knowledge that if today was not the day they fixed the problem, tomorrow might be the last day they flew at all. The entire future of air warfare hung precariously on a single, yet-to-be-deployed solution. The fix, when it finally arrived, was not a secret weapon forged in some hidden laboratory, but a magnificent convergence of existing technology and desperate engineering finesse. It was known quietly, simply as Operation Argument, or more famously, Big Week. But before Big Week could launch, the logistics chain had to be solved, and the tool for that solution was a fighter aircraft initially dismissed as too fragile, too refined: the North American P-51 Mustang. Chet Harmon, surviving the bloodbath of the autumn raids, found himself increasingly involved in planning sessions where the atmosphere was heavy with either grim determination or outright despair. General Doolittle, recently having taken command of the 8th Air Force, understood the essential truth: kill the fighter and the bomber lives. The target shifted from merely destroying industry to destroying the capacity to defend that industry. They needed to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle, but on Allied terms. And Allied terms meant range. The earlier P-51A and B models, while fast, still struggled with true long-range penetration when burdened with drop tanks. The breakthrough, the crucial modification that would tilt the balance of power permanently, involved two key elements that fundamentally changed the geometry of the air war. First, the adoption of the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, specifically the V1650, which gave the sleek airframe astonishing power at high altitude, where the B-17s lived. Second, and perhaps more crucial for the strategic shift, was the integration of larger, jettisonable external fuel tanks. Initially, these tanks were often clumsy, built from pressurized paper and resin, a material known as pressed paper, which, while effective, were prone to leaking and instability. But the shift to robust metal tanks, paired with the internal auxiliary tank behind the pilot seat in the later P-51D model, extended the Mustang's combat radius dramatically. Suddenly, the fighters weren't just covering the ingress. They could now reach Berlin, Leipzig, Regensburg, and most critically, they could loiter, engaging the German defenders on their own ground and stripping them of the ability to reform for counterattack. The objective of Big Week, planned for February 1944, was audacious. Hit every major assembly plant and engine factory in Germany simultaneously, across multiple days, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit their depleted reserves or watch their industrial base crumble uncontested. It was a massive, coordinated effort involving not just the US 8th Air Force in England, but the 15th Air Force operating out of Italy, hitting the southern German targets. The scale was unprecedented, designed to overwhelm German air defenses through sheer volume and relentless pressure. The airmen knew this was the ultimate gamble. If the combined bomber forces could not withstand the inevitable counterattack, the losses would cripple the strategic campaign for good. But if they succeeded, if the Mustangs truly delivered the promised escort to the furthest reaches of the Third Reich, then the skies over Europe would change forever. The Mustangs were more than just flying gas tanks. They were precision instruments of aerial destruction, a stark contrast to the rugged, brute force designs that had defined the earlier years of the war. Their laminar flow wing, a design marvel conceived by North American aviation engineer Edgar Schmid, offered exceptional efficiency and speed, particularly at the high altitudes where the bomber formations operated. This aerodynamic refinement meant that the Merlin engine could push the P-51 to speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour, often leaving the standard German fighters of the time playing catch-up, especially in a dive. The German pilots, trained to respect the short range of the P-47 and the Spitfire, found themselves facing a silver ghost that appeared deep inside the Reich, often miles past the point of anticipated engagement, a psychological blow that was almost as damaging as the machine guns themselves. The transition to the P-51D, the definitive model, was characterized not just by the teardrop bubble canopy, offering unmatched all-around visibility crucial for the eyes-in-the-sky escort role, but also by the powerful battery of 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber machine guns. These weapons, aligned for convergent fire at standard engagement ranges, delivered a devastating punch. They lacked the raw explosive power of the German 20mm or 30mm cannons, but the sheer volume of high-velocity ammunition they threw, often armor-piercing incendiary API rounds, meant that if a German fighter was hit, it was almost certain to burn or disintegrate. The tactics employed by the new long-range fighter groups, specifically tailored for the Mustang's strengths, moved away from close, defensive formation flying. Instead, they adopted a Zemke's fan strategy named after Colonel Hubert Zemke, which emphasized aggressive, high-altitude sweeps far ahead of the bomber stream, seeking out the German assembly points and attacking them before they could even form up for an intercept. This strategy was predicated entirely on the Mustang's unprecedented endurance. Before February 1944, the Luftwaffe could conserve its fuel and pilots, waiting until the American fighters turned back near the limit of their range before launching their main attack. Now, the hunters were being hunted deep within their own territory. Every German pilot taking off from a forward airfield understood the new, terrifying reality. The sky was no longer a safe sanctuary for them to prepare their defense. The silvery aircraft, appearing like avenging angels in the harsh sunlight, were now patrolling the entire length of the bomber route, forcing the defenders into continuous, exhausting combat, chewing up pilots and aircraft reserves at an unsustainable rate. This technological leap combined with the tactical shift was the quiet preamble to Operation Argument, preparing the field for the moment of total air dominance. The air in the briefing hut at Debden, deep in the English countryside, was thick with the smell of stale coffee, tobacco smoke, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. It was 0300 hours, February 20th, 1944. Outside, a thick, freezing fog hugged the runways, delaying the start of the greatest air campaign in history. But inside, the atmosphere was white-hot with nervous energy. Chet Harmon, now flying the advanced lead B-17 for his group, stood hunched over the massive map pinned to the wall, studying the red yarn tracing their route. Across the North Sea, over the Dutch coast, southeast past Brunswick, and deep into the heart of the German aircraft manufacturing complex centered around Leipzig and Bernburg. Major General Jimmy Doolittle himself stood before the gathered crews, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. "Gentlemen, this is not just another raid. This is Operation Argument. We are going for the jugular. We are not just hitting factories. We are hitting the Luftwaffe's ability to wage war permanently. Every single group will fly, every single sortie will count. We will fly today, tomorrow, and the day after, until the targets are obliterated or the weather grounds us. There will be no let-up." The sheer scale of the coordination was staggering. Over 1,000 bombers from the 8th Air Force were scheduled to fly that day, protected by nearly 800 fighters. Simultaneously, the 15th Air Force was launching a complementary strike against vital targets in southern Germany and Austria. The intelligence reports projected the most intense opposition yet, a desperate, final attempt by the Germans to defend their industrial base. Chet traced the fighter escort schedule with his finger. The P-51 groups, identifiable by their distinctive nose colors, red, yellow, blue checkers, were assigned the deepest penetration and the highest altitude patrol, tasked with clearing the sky for the bombers. The tension was palpable. The men were acutely aware that previous attempts at massive strategic strikes had resulted in catastrophic losses. The difference today, the crucial factor everyone pinned their hopes on, was the full deployment of the P-51 Mustang. Doolittle finished his brief by emphasizing the new fighter directive. Escort is paramount, but hunting is encouraged. If you see a lone German airfield, if you see fighters lining up to attack, you do not wait. You engage. We must grind them down in the air, forcing them to burn fuel and pilots they cannot afford to lose. The goal is air superiority, gentlemen. Absolute superiority. As the crews filtered out into the cold, the waiting seemed unbearable. The fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing a metallic pre-dawn sky. Chet walked out to the Iron Maiden, slapping the cold aluminum skin. Today was the day they would either prove the Mustang strategy worked, or they would pay the ultimate price for betting everything on range. Down on the cold, muddy perimeter of the airfields, the ground crews worked in a frenzy of focused exhaustion, their breath clouding white in the frigid pre-dawn air. This was the silent, brutal labor that made the dominance possible, the meticulous preparation of machines destined for hell. The maintenance crews, often working 36 hours straight during the surge operations like Big Week, were the unsung heroes, their hands permanently stained with hydraulic fluid and oil, constantly battling fatigue and the persistent, damp cold of England. For the B-17s, this meant ensuring that every one of the 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns was perfectly aligned, cleaned, and loaded with the massive ammunition belts. Each belt contained a lethal mix of tracer, incendiary, and armor-piercing rounds, calculated to maximize damage against heavily armored German fighters. The guns needed to be zeroed with precision, ensuring the fire converged at the optimal distance of about 300 yards. A single misalignment could mean the difference between a hit and a miss when milliseconds counted. Equally crucial was the delicate process of arming the bombs. Hundreds of 500-pound general-purpose bombs were hoisted into the bomb bay of Chet Harmon's Iron Maiden, each fitted with the correct fuses and safety wires. The armorers moved with practiced speed, the metallic clinking sound a grim symphony of preparation for mass destruction. For the P-51s, the workload was even more specialized and time-sensitive. Fuel was the paramount concern. The internal tanks were topped off, and the fragile, crucial external drop tanks, now primarily metal or hardened paper, were meticulously secured under the wings. These tanks, holding over 100 gallons each, were the lifeblood of the deep penetration mission. They had to feed the thirsty Merlin engine reliably for the first crucial hours of the journey, until they could be jettisoned over enemy territory, transforming the heavy escort fighter back into a nimble dogfighter. The mechanics checked every bolt on the engine cowling, verified the oxygen systems, critical for a mission lasting 8 to 10 hours at high altitude, and polished the perspex of the bubble canopies, ensuring perfect visibility. The sheer volume of aircraft requiring this level of preparation was staggering. Every airfield in the East Anglian region of England was simultaneously preparing for this colossal effort. The noise, as the first four-engine monsters began to rumble to life, shattering the pre-dawn quiet, was deafening. A sound that signaled both immense power and terrible vulnerability. The ground crew chief gave Chet a sharp salute as he climbed aboard the fortress, a look of profound worry etched on his face. "Bring her back, Colonel," he shouted over the rising roar of the engines. That simple plea encapsulated the shared destiny of the ground crews and the flying men. The success of the mission and the survival of the crews rested on the flawless performance of these perfectly prepared machines. The takeoff sequence for Operation Argument was a chaos of controlled violence, a choreographed ballet of noise, smoke, and nervous energy enacted across dozens of airfields simultaneously. The heavy bombers, fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition, were beasts fighting gravity. Chet Harmon wrestled the yoke of Iron Maiden, the heavily burdened B-17 straining against the muddy runway, its four engines screaming in protest. The air was cold and dense, which provided lift, but the fog still clung stubbornly in pockets, swirling across the tarmac and obscuring the peripheral vision necessary for formation flying. The danger was immense during this phase. If one plane aborted its takeoff, or if a pilot misjudged the distance in the reduced visibility, a catastrophic collision involving thousands of pounds of high explosives was inevitable. Pilots relied almost entirely on instrument readings and the meager green runway lights flashing past. Once airborne, the real challenge began: the rendezvous. Over 1,000 aircraft had to coalesce into the tightly controlled combat boxes, climbing slowly through the layered clouds and freezing air to their operational altitude of 25,000 feet. This was where the 8th Air Force perfected its brutal efficiency. The formation assembly was guided by massive radio beacons and prearranged timing sequences, but ultimately relied on the sharp eyes and steady hands of the pilots. Climbing through the soup meant battling severe icing. Ice accretion on the wings and props reduced lift and threatened engine performance, forcing the gunners to constantly scan for structural changes. Chet's concentration was total, every muscle tense, fighting the heavy controls of the bomber while keeping sight of his group leader, a tiny silhouette against the gray sky. The vulnerability of the slow climb was a well-known risk. Any German fighter patrol finding the ascending formation would have a field day. But today, the sheer numbers provided a kind of defense, a dense cloud of aircraft making an attack almost impossible without causing friendly fire. As they punched through the last layer of cloud, the world transformed. Above them, the sky was a deep, crystalline blue, illuminated by the barely visible sun. Below lay an endless ocean of white cloud cover, a blank slate stretching to the horizon. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. It meant they were now on the clock, fully committed, their path taking them inexorably toward the German coast, where the silent enemy waited. The bombers stabilized at altitude, the tight formation minimizing the gaps for interceptors. The gunners began the cold, lonely vigil in the freezing turrets, testing their guns with short, sharp bursts, the metallic smell of gunpowder briefly invading the clean, cold high-altitude air. They were the flying fortress, but without their long-legged knights, they were still just targets waiting for the executioner. The initial leg of the journey over the frigid expanse of the North Sea was a time of cold, grinding monotony for Chet and his crew. The atmosphere inside the Iron Maiden was dominated by the rhythmic roar of the engines and the constant, high-pitched whine of the oxygen system, essential for life at 25,000 feet. The air temperature outside was often 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, turning any exposed metal into a deadly conductor of cold. The men had learned to cope with the physical demands. Heavy, shearling-lined flying gear, frequent checks of their oxygen masks to prevent frostbite and hypoxia, and the constant movement of fingers and toes to stave off the penetrating chill. Inside the cramped confines of the bomber, the crew settled into their long-haul routines. The navigator, Lieutenant Miller, sat hunched over his charts, meticulously charting their progress against the strong prevailing winds, making minute adjustments to the course. Navigation at this altitude was a delicate blend of dead reckoning, celestial observation, and the reliance on the H-2S radar system, nicknamed Mickey, which provided a rudimentary ground map display, crucial when flying over dense cloud cover. Any navigational error could lead the bomber stream hundreds of miles off course, exposing them to unexpected flak zones or missing the critical fighter rendezvous points. Meanwhile, the radioman monitored the airwaves, maintaining strict radio silence except for coded essential communications. The isolation was profound. For hours, they saw only the relentless blue sky above, the cloud deck below, and the tight, protective geometry of their own combat wing. Chet, maintaining the precise speed and altitude, found his mind drifting, not to the fear ahead, but to the deep responsibility he carried for the 9 lives behind him. He thought of the immense logistical tail that had launched them, the factories, the mechanics, the fuel convoys, all culminating in this tiny, fragile shell of aluminum hurtling through the stratosphere. The vastness of the enterprise was humbling. Then, the silence was abruptly broken by the quiet, controlled voice of the navigator coming over the intercom. "Coastal warning, Colonel. We are 10 minutes from landfall, northern Netherlands. Time to target revised." The shift was instantaneous. The monotony evaporated, replaced by a spike of adrenaline. The air was no longer just cold. It was charged. Every gunner was now alert, peering down through the waste windows and the ball turret, scanning the horizon for the first signs of German radar pickup, the inevitable flak, or worst of all, the sudden appearance of interceptors. The German coastline was a thin, jagged line of muted brown and white against the gray of the North Sea, a geographical frontier that symbolized the transition from relative safety to immediate, mortal danger. As the thousands of American aircraft crossed into the airspace of occupied Europe, the German air defense system, though reeling from earlier strikes, reacted with characteristic brutality and efficiency. The initial warning came not visually, but acoustically, a dull, rhythmic thudding from the ground far below, preceding the appearance of the black and gray puffs of anti-aircraft fire, known simply as Flak. These were the heavy 88mm batteries, positioned along the coastal defenses and key transit corridors, firing thousands of rounds blindly into the altitude where the bombers were predicted to fly. The Flak was often more psychological than deadly, a constant reminder that they were deep inside the enemy's grasp. However, a direct hit from an 88 shell was instantaneous death, ripping aircraft apart with shrapnel and explosive force. Chet Harmon wrestled the Iron Maiden through the turbulent air created by the bursts, the impact of the explosions shaking the heavy bomber violently. The constant concussions felt like a giant repeatedly punching the fuselage. The gunners shouted reports over the intercom. "Flak at 11 o'clock high. Getting close, Colonel." The air was rapidly becoming saturated with the dark smoke of the explosions, forcing Chet to rely on his instruments and the wingtips of his element leader to maintain formation integrity. But the real danger was not the Flak. It was the inevitable appearance of the Luftwaffe fighters. German radar stations, despite being targets themselves, were tracking the colossal bomber stream, vectoring the scattered Gruppen of FW-190s and Bf-109s into intercept positions deeper inland. The strategy the Germans employed was terrifyingly aggressive. The Ramjager Ram fighters, often inexperienced or older pilots flying stripped-down fighters, were sometimes instructed to literally ram the bombers as a last, desperate measure, a suicidal tactic designed to sow chaos and break up the formations. As the bombers pushed past the coastal defenses and toward the initial industrial zones, the first visual contacts were made. Specks appeared far ahead, growing rapidly into the unmistakable, boxy silhouettes of Focke-Wulf 190s, heavy, fast, and armed with brutal cannons. The Germans were launching their attack early, attempting to exploit the one window of vulnerability the Americans feared most: the gap before the long-range escort could arrive and fully establish its protective screen. The tension in the bomber stream was now agonizing. The men knew that without the Silver Saviors, they were moments away from a repeat of the black days of the previous year. The air crackled with desperate urgency as the German interceptors, having scrambled from hidden airfields deep in the Reich, began their initial probing attacks. The formations were still tight, but the Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of years of defending the fatherland, were masters of exploitation. They knew the weak points of the American formation, the stragglers, the plane with a smoking engine, the vulnerable low squadron. Chet watched in horrified fascination as a flight of 4 brightly nosed Bf-109s, likely from JG-3, executed a devastating head-on pass against the lead wing of the group ahead of them. The bombers' nose guns flared in response, but the speed of the attack was dizzying. One fortress momentarily slewed sideways, its number 2 engine bursting into flame, and the whole crew knew it was doomed. This critical period, roughly half an hour after the Flak eased off and before the scheduled long-range escort rendezvous, was the Luftwaffe's final chance to inflict unacceptable damage. The American High Command had gambled on the P-51s reaching the bombers on time, but high winds and unexpected icing during the climb had delayed several key fighter groups. The bomber crews were exposed, relying solely on the concentration of their own defensive fire, creating a defensive box of crossfire that made entry perilous but not impossible for the determined German pilots. The air became thick with tracer rounds, a slow, terrifying fireworks display of glowing red streams zipping toward the attacking fighters. Chet's gunners were firing steadily, the sound of the 50 calibers drumming a rhythmic, desperate beat against the roar of the engines. "Tail gunner reports heavy attack from 6 o'clock low," shouted the radio operator. Chet dipped the wings slightly, forcing the gunners to adjust their aim, trying to present a moving target. He could hear the impacts against his own aircraft sharp, deafening clangs as 20mm rounds hit the armored plating and the aluminum skin. The cockpit smelled of cordite and burnt insulation. It was a terrifying dance, the bombers lumbering giants against the darting, deadly fighters, and the odds, for this brief, agonizing period, still favored the speed and striking power of the attackers. The seconds stretched into an eternity. They needed the Mustangs, and they needed them now. Just as despair began to settle over the exposed bomber stream, as the lead elements of several groups saw their formations fractured by the vicious, close-in attacks of the Focke-Wulfs, a new sound penetrated the cacophony of the battle. It was a sound entirely distinct from the deep, throaty roar of the Reich cyclones, and fundamentally different from the high-pitched shriek of the German Daimler-Benz engines. This was the clean, powerful, high RPM snarl of the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin. The fighter pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, having fought their way through the weather delays and pushed their fuel reserves to the very limit, arrived precisely where they were needed, high above the bomber stream, a shimmering, massive silver shield appearing from the deep blue above the clouds. The relief that washed through Chet Harmon's cockpit was so intense it was physical. His clenched muscles momentarily relaxed, allowing him to take a deep, shaky breath of oxygen. "Fighters! 12 high! God bless them! They're Mustangs!" screamed the top turret gunner, his voice choked with emotion. The arrival was not merely visual. It was strategic. The German fighter groups attacking the bombers had committed to their low-altitude passes, focusing entirely on the bomber target. They were suddenly, brutally, surprised by the swift, high-energy attack from above. The P-51 pilots, many of them seasoned veterans like Don Gentile and John Godfrey, didn't hesitate. They employed the classic boom and zoom tactic, diving from 30,000 feet with massive speed advantage, turning their heavy, high-velocity aircraft into terrifying projectiles. The silver paint of the Mustangs, reflecting the sunlight, seemed to flash as they unleashed their 6.50 caliber guns, streams of tracers converging onto the unsuspecting German fighters below. The effect was immediate and devastating. A flight of 3 Bf-109s that had just completed a pass on the high squadron were instantly bracketed by the deadly fire. One exploded violently in a blossoming cloud of fuel and smoke. The second spun down, already on fire. The third broke formation in a desperate, fuel-guzzling turn that carried it away from the bomber stream and directly into the path of a second P-51 element. This was the moment of air dominance realized. The P-51s were not just defending the bombers. They were proactively hunting and destroying the enemy air force in deep enemy territory, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight on fundamentally unfavorable terms. The Silver Cavalry had arrived, and the war in the skies was about to take a decisive turn. The sky immediately transformed into a vortex of high-speed combat, a massive, swirling three-dimensional arena where the Mustangs fought with a calculated aggression the Germans had not yet experienced. This was not the brief skirmish of earlier raids. This was the long, grinding battle of attrition the 8th Air Force had planned for, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit every available resource. The P-51 pilots, utilizing their superior speed and the high-altitude advantage provided by the Merlin engine, focused ruthlessly on disrupting the German assembly formations. The combat philosophy was clear: prevent the German fighters from ever reaching the defensive formation fire of the bombers. Lieutenant Duke Ellington, flying a Mustang named Miss Helen, experienced the chaos firsthand. He spotted a formation of FW-190s attempting to climb and reposition after their initial pass. Ellington immediately dropped his external fuel tanks, the metal shells tumbling away toward the fields below, lightening his load and maximizing his maneuverability. He executed a massive, sweeping dive, picking up tremendous speed, targeting the leader of the German formation. The Focke-Wulf pilot, realizing the threat, tried a sharp brake, but the P-51 speed was relentless. Ellington held his breath, leading the target perfectly in his reflector sight, squeezing the trigger. The 6.50 caliber guns thundered, spitting out a staggering volume of API rounds. The rounds hit the engine cowling and wing root of the FW-190. The plane shuddered violently, a flash of white-hot magnesium indicating the end. The battle quickly dissolved into dozens of individual dogfights, characterized by high-G turns, Immelmans, and energy-depleting vertical maneuvers. The Mustang's ability to retain energy in high-speed maneuvers gave them a critical edge. They could dive onto a target, execute the kill, and then immediately climb back to altitude, preserving the advantage. Meanwhile, the B-17s, momentarily relieved of the intense, close-in pressure, continued their steady, relentless push toward the targets. Their gunners, while still vigilant, could focus their fire on the few German fighters desperate enough to punch through the P-51 screen, often catching the attention of the Mustang pilots who would then sweep in for the final kill. The air battle was immense, stretching over dozens of cubic miles of airspace. Down below, the German radio operators were reporting horrifying losses, not just of pilots, but of entire flights annihilated before they could even launch their attack. The deep penetration escort was working precisely as intended, systematically dismantling the Luftwaffe's defensive capability plane by plane, pilot by pilot, miles from the safe haven of the German fighter airfields. The air battle raged on, hour after agonizing hour, stretching the limits of endurance for every man involved. The B-17 crews, though protected, felt the immense vibrations of the air combat surrounding them, the sky filled with the metallic scent of burnt aviation fuel and the occasional sight of a smoking parachute. Allied or Axis, it was impossible to tell. Meanwhile, the German pilots, specifically those attached to the Reichsverteidigung, defense of the Reich units, were experiencing a profound psychological shock. They were fighting machines that simply shouldn't be there. Their intelligence reports had always listed specific maximum escort ranges. The P-51, with its long, sleek lines, symbolized the catastrophic failure of that intelligence and the chilling reality of Allied technological supremacy. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, flying a heavily armored Bf-109G, had managed to survive 3 previous passes at the bomber formation, but his fuel indicator was flashing a critical warning, and he was miles from any friendly strip. He had seen 3 of his comrades explode in the space of 10 minutes, victims of the silver fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The Mustangs didn't fight defensively, they hunted aggressively, forcing the Germans into fuel-burning maneuvers they couldn't sustain. Richter tried to pull a tight turn to shake a particularly aggressive Mustang that was glued to his 6, but the P-51 pilot simply followed the arc, maintaining the firing solution. Richter realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that the American pilot wasn't just highly skilled. His aircraft possessed a critical margin of performance that Richter's aging Bf-109 could not match, particularly with the weight of armor plating intended for bomber interception. This was the moment the paradigm shifted, when superior numbers, superior range, and superior energy management combined to create an unbeatable force. The German pilot was now fighting not for victory, but for survival, a defensive posture that meant the strategic battle was already lost. They were paying the price in irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircraft, a currency the Reich could no longer print. This shift, from defending their homeland to desperately surviving overwhelming firepower, is a profound study in the collapse of military morale. It forces us to ask a difficult, thought-provoking question about the nature of warfare. Is there a moral obligation to refuse a battle when you know definitively that the casualties you suffer will cripple your nation's defense for years to come? Or does the duty to your home necessitate fighting to the very last man and machine, even when facing certain long-term defeat? Share your thoughts on this complex moral dilemma in the comments below. Your perspective on the harsh realities faced by both sides helps us understand the immense sacrifices made in this war. For Klaus Richter, the moment of decision was upon him. His engine sputtered, coughing due to fuel starvation, and the relentless fire of the Mustang finally caught his wing root. He rolled the canopy back, bracing himself for the terrifying leap into the frozen air. One more veteran pilot lost forever to the skies dominated by the American machine. The intense aerial combat preceding the target zone ensured that when the bomber stream finally arrived over the massive industrial complexes of Leipzig and Bernburg, the remaining flak defenses and fighter opposition were scattered and disorganized. Chet Harmon gripped the controls as the Iron Maiden approached the initial point, IP, the precise geographical landmark used to begin the bombing run. Below the scattered clouds, the target factories, sprawling complexes of hangars, assembly sheds, and power stations were suddenly visible through a break in the smoke and mist. The air over the target was still hostile, marked by dense, accurate flak barrages specifically tuned to the bombing altitude. The explosions were not random. They were patterned, designed to shatter the formation precisely when the Norden bombsight was brought into operation. The Norden, an instrument of almost mythical precision, required the bombardier to maintain a steady, straight and level course for several agonizing minutes leading up to the release point. This straight-line run made the B-17 sitting ducks for ground fire, a sacrifice of maneuverability necessary for accuracy. Lieutenant Rogers, the bombardier, clicked on the intercom, his voice taut with concentration. "Bomb bay doors open. Starting the run, Colonel. Holding steady." The entire aircraft shivered slightly as the massive bomb bay doors retracted. The cold air rushed into the fuselage, immediately dropping the internal temperature. Chet focused entirely on keeping the plane absolutely level, fighting the turbulence from the flak bursts and the occasional wind shear. He could see other fortresses ahead of him releasing their payloads, a terrifying sight of hundreds of heavy ordnance pieces tumbling end over end toward the earth, leaving behind only the gray smoke of the high-explosive fuses. Moments later, Rogers shouted, "Bombs away! Close doors!" The immediate, physical relief of losing the immense weight of the bomb load was instantly noticeable. The B-17 surged upward, lighter and more responsive. Chet immediately initiated a banking turn to exit the flak zone, the roar of the engines changing pitch as he dove slightly for speed. Looking back, he saw the initial impact of the high-explosive bombs on the factories. Plumes of thick, oily black smoke mixed with concrete dust, and the secondary explosions of fuel dumps and ammunition stores. Operation Argument was hitting its strategic objective. The German industrial base was burning. But the mission was far from over. They still had the long, perilous journey home. The sheer cost of the engagement, even in the midst of strategic victory, began to manifest violently inside the formations. As the bomber stream reformed for the long trek back toward the North Sea, the damage assessments became grimly apparent. The air was littered with stragglers, crippled bombers trailing smoke, struggling to maintain altitude, perfect prey for any remaining German fighters. Chet Harmon looked across his wing to see the mighty Moose, a fortress he recognized, listing heavily, its number 3 engine feathered, the propeller standing still like a dark cross against the sky. The pilot was clearly trying to nurse the wounded bird toward the Dutch coast, but its reduced speed made it an easy target. Inside the Iron Maiden, the crew conducted their internal damage checks. The fuselage was peppered with small, dark holes from flak shrapnel, and one of the waist gunners reported that the oxygen line near his station had been nicked, forcing him to rely on his emergency bottle. More serious was the condition of Sergeant Riley, the tail gunner, who reported a small wound to his arm, sustained during a close scrape with an FW-190 on the ingress. The assistant engineer quickly scrambled back to provide basic first aid, administering morphine and wrapping the wound tightly, all while ensuring the vital functions of the aircraft remained nominal. The emotional toll, however, was far heavier than the physical damage. Every man had witnessed multiple deaths that day, aircraft exploding, parachutes failing, or the terrible, silent sight of a B-17 falling out of formation, never to return. The adrenaline high of the combat phase began to wear off, replaced by the profound exhaustion and emotional numbness that characterized the veteran air crews. They were survivors, but the price of their survival was the knowledge of the human sacrifice made just feet away in the sky. Yet, this time, the grim accounting was different. When the formation gathered its strength for the return, the fighter escort was still there. The silver Mustangs, though lower on fuel and equally damaged, maintained their protective positions, weaving above and around the bombers. They had stayed the course, achieving the true deep penetration escort that had eluded the 8th Air Force for years. This presence of the P-51s, miles past the traditional safe zone, instilled a new confidence, a quiet, profound realization that the terror of unescorted withdrawal was, perhaps, finally over. The price was high. The initial estimate was 45 B-17s lost on the first day of Big Week, but the German losses were catastrophic, exceeding 200 irreplaceable fighters destroyed or damaged, shattering the Luftwaffe's ability to mount another coordinated defense of this magnitude. The deep penetration phase proved to be the most decisive, solidifying American air dominance not just over the targets, but over the entire operational depth of the Reich. As the battered bomber stream turned west, heading for the sanctuary of the English Channel, the P-51 groups, critically low on fuel but still possessing combat energy, engaged German reserves trying desperately to mount a final rearguard action. Luftwaffe command, reeling from the colossal losses over Leipzig and Bernburg, had committed every available fighter, including trainers and aircraft pulled from quiet sectors, to intercept the retreating American force. These were often flown by younger, less experienced pilots, thrown into the meat grinder against the highly trained veterans of the Mustang groups. This was where the technological mismatch became utterly brutal. The P-51D, equipped with the K-14 gun sight, a significant upgrade over earlier reflector sights, allowed pilots to track and lead their targets with higher precision during complex maneuvers. Its speed and climb rate, especially when lightened of drop tanks, allowed Mustang pilots to choose the terms of engagement, often simply bypassing or outclimbing the older Bf-109 variants the Germans were forced to use. Colonel Harmon, looking through the cockpit window of his fortress, saw the true scale of the dominance unfold. A single Mustang diving into a disorganized pack of 4 German fighters, scattering them instantly, then picking off 2 in quick succession before climbing vertically to avoid the others. The German resistance was desperate, but lacked coordination. It was a piecemeal defense against a highly organized, relentless force. The strategic success was now moving beyond mere defense. The Mustangs were achieving a localized air superiority across a 1,000-mile front. They were methodically destroying the core strength of the Luftwaffe. Not just the machines, but the trained men required to fly them. Pilots shot down over Germany were lost forever to the defense effort, a critical attrition rate that the German training pipeline could simply not sustain. This systematic destruction of the fighter arm, deep in the Reich's heartland, meant that future bomber raids would face rapidly diminishing opposition, fundamentally shifting the cost-benefit analysis of strategic bombing. The price of keeping the Luftwaffe in the air had just become too high for the Third Reich to bear. Inside the heavily reinforced concrete command bunkers, deep beneath Berlin, the reports filtering in from the air defense sectors across Germany sounded like the death knell of the Luftwaffe. Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring, bloated and furious, slammed his fist onto the map table, scattering miniature fighter planes. His face, usually flushed with forced joviality, was pale with rage and mounting dread. The numbers were undeniable, delivered in monotone voices by terrified intelligence officers. Over 200 aircraft confirmed lost in a single operational day, with reports still incomplete. The worst statistic was the loss of seasoned, irreplaceable veteran pilots, many of whom had fought since the Battle of Britain. 200 machines. Where are they getting the endurance? They should have turned back hours ago. The American intelligence is flawed. I tell you, Göring bellowed, refusing to accept the reality of the P-51's true capability. The generals around him knew the truth. The Mustang had broken the operational depth barrier. The doctrine that assumed American fighters had a limited reach was now utterly obsolete. The entire concept of the Reich defense, which relied on reserves and the cyclical deployment of interceptors waiting in safe zones, was shattered. The Mustang pilots were now patrolling the German home airfields, catching fighter planes as they landed to refuel or taking off in confused haste. The air supremacy the Luftwaffe had enjoyed for the initial years of the war was not just being contested. It was being irrevocably seized. The implication of Big Week was not just the destruction of aircraft factories that could, theoretically, be moved underground and production accelerated, but the systemic collapse of the German ability to replace trained human capital. A Bf-109 could be assembled in weeks. A combat-ready pilot took years. The constant, grinding pressure exerted by the long-range escort meant that the German fighter force was being permanently degraded, unable to train, refuel, or regroup without immediate harassment. This day, February 20th, 1944, marked the end of the Luftwaffe as an effective strategic force. Göring's fury was the sound of a once great air force being broken, leaving the vital German ground forces exposed and the industrial heartland defenseless against the relentless American air power that would now only grow stronger. As the sun began its long descent, casting fiery orange and purple hues across the shattered landscape of occupied Europe, the returning bomber stream crossed the Rhine and eventually the coast of the Netherlands. This was traditionally the most dangerous part of the return trip, where Luftwaffe pilots, desperate to achieve a kill before the American fighters ran dry, often launched a final high-energy attack. But today, the sky was eerily clear of serious opposition. The P-51 pilots, nursing their engines and meticulously monitoring the critically low fuel gauges, remained glued to the bomber formations. The mission profile of the Mustang required agonizing precision in fuel management. Every gallon saved meant another 10 minutes of combat endurance or, critically, the ability to reach a friendly base. For the Mustang pilots, the return was a white-knuckle test of navigational skill and discipline. They flew in tight, fuel-saving formations, their long-range radios communicating with patrol planes positioned over the channel, coordinating the final leg. Chet Harmon, watching the escort fighters wobble slightly in the turbulence, felt a profound bond with these pilots. They had risked running out of fuel over hostile territory just to ensure the B-17s made it home. Their devotion was the ultimate proof of the new partnership between bomber and fighter. The few German patrols that did appear, lone aircraft or small, cautious flights, were instantly pounced upon by the remaining Mustangs, eliminating even the straggling threats. The psychological effect of the unbroken escort was massive. For the B-17 crews, the sight of those silver wings meant the nightmares of previous unescorted runs, where they watched helplessly as crippled comrades were picked off by waiting German fighters, were finally receding. For the Luftwaffe, it meant that even in retreat, the American Air Force was dominant, aggressive, and utterly unforgiving. By the time the formation crossed the English Channel, the exhaustion was total. The crews were physically depleted by the cold, the G-forces of evasion, and the sheer tension of the 9-hour mission. But as the familiar green fields of England appeared below, there was an unprecedented feeling of shared victory. They had flown the gauntlet, delivered the payload, and, most importantly, the new strategy had held. The cost had been high, but the strategic gains were exponential. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Landing back at Debden in the late evening gloom was not a moment of celebration, but a controlled return to reality, marked by the grim task of accounting. The moment the engines of the Iron Maiden fell silent, the exhaustion hit Chet Harmon like a physical blow. The air inside the bomber, stale with oxygen fumes and cordite smoke, felt suddenly stifling. Ground crews immediately swarmed the returning aircraft, their faces anxious. They didn't ask how the mission went. They asked, who didn't make it back? The holes in the formation were stark, painful evidence of the losses. On the flight line, maintenance crews began the gruesome work of counting the bullet and shrapnel holes, the patch-up job. Every returning plane was meticulously inspected, the aluminum skin bearing the scars of combat. Chet supervised the unloading of the .50 caliber belts. The piles of spent brass casings were a testament to the intensity of the defensive fire they had put up. For the returning crews, the initial debriefing was focused on the immediate facts. target visibility, accuracy, flak intensity, and most critically, the performance and tactics of the enemy fighters and the success of the escort. Intelligence officers pressed the gunners for details on the number and type of German fighters encountered, seeking to build a precise picture of the attrition inflicted. The emotional weight of the mission often made detailed recall difficult, but the consensus was clear. The Luftwaffe had fought with desperation, but their defense had been overwhelmed. The key observation reiterated again and again was the profound reach of the P-51s. Bomber crews reported seeing Mustangs engaging German fighters deeper into the Reich than ever before, often pursuing them down to treetop level to ensure the kill, a shift from defensive escort to offensive sweep. Meanwhile, at the nearby fighter bases, the atmosphere was a mix of intense pride and sheer exhaustion. Pilots were interrogated about their kill claims, which required independent confirmation by gun camera footage and multiple witness testimonies. The hard numbers, once collated and verified over the next 48 hours, would confirm the magnitude of the success. Big Week, over its initial days, proved to be the single most destructive series of battles the Luftwaffe had ever faced, confirming the long-range escort strategy not merely as viable, but as the war-winning doctrine that would define the rest of the campaign. For Chet and his crew, as they trudged toward the relative warmth of the mess hall, the weight of the missing men settled heavily, 45 bombers gone. But the mission's success tasted like a grim, necessary victory, purchased at a terrible price. The strategic debriefing rooms at 8th Air Force headquarters buzzed with a controlled frenzy in the days following the initial onslaught of Operation Argument. The intelligence section, working around the clock, synthesized the mountains of data flowing in. Reconnaissance photographs showing obliteration of key factory components, debriefing reports confirming heavy air combat, and, most crucially, the verified German aircraft losses. The numbers, when finally aggregated, were astonishing. Over the course of the six-day operation, the American forces had launched nearly 3,300 bomber sorties and over 3,000 fighter sorties. While the 8th Air Force suffered significant losses, well over 200 bombers and 30 fighters destroyed or heavily damaged, the German cost was paralyzing. Initial verified kill claims by American fighter pilots alone reached nearly 600 German aircraft destroyed in the air, with hundreds more destroyed on the ground during coordinated sweeps of German airfields. This wasn't just a loss of material, it was a decapitation strike against the German Air Force's elite. Intelligence analysts confirmed that the factories hit, primarily those producing the Bf-109, FW-190, and critical engine components, would be out of production for months, severely restricting the Luftwaffe's ability to replace losses. The strategic victory was dual-layered. Industrial output was crippled, and, critically, the fighting force defending that output was decimated. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, reviewed the data with grim satisfaction. His gamble had paid off. He had forced the Luftwaffe into a decisive confrontation, a battle of attrition it was mathematically certain to lose due to the American industrial base's capacity to replace men and machines far faster than the shrinking German economy. The confirmation that the P-51 could sustain combat operations deep over Berlin meant that nowhere in the Reich was safe. The Luftwaffe could no longer dictate when and where air battles occurred. From this day forward, the American 8th Air Force would dictate the terms, leveraging their long-range escort to fly wherever the strategic target lay, forcing the German air defense into a perpetual losing scramble. The era of daylight strategic bombing, previously contested and prohibitively costly, was now validated as the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal, paving the way for the inevitable ground invasion. The sustained pressure of Big Week fundamentally altered the German war effort, crippling not just production capacity, but also the national psyche. The constant, unrelenting attacks on critical targets like the Messerschmitt plants and the crucial synthetic oil refineries meant that even if the Germans managed to repair a bombed factory, they couldn't power the fuel-starved air force needed to defend it. The destruction of the synthetic fuel facilities was a slow-acting poison, reducing the availability of high-octane aviation fuel to a trickle. This had cascading effects. Training flights for new pilots were severely curtailed, meaning the few surviving planes had increasingly untrained men in the cockpit. Furthermore, the precious fuel had to be reserved for the front lines, limiting the ability of existing units to practice, reposition, or even adequately defend their airfields. In a desperate attempt to maintain production continuity, the German High Command ordered a rapid and massive dispersal of remaining factory capacity, moving assembly lines underground into massive, hidden complexes like Mittelwerk, Dora, in the Harz Mountains. While this provided protection from bombs, the subterranean move introduced immense logistical complexities, reduced efficiency, and significantly degraded the quality control of the final products. Aircraft rolling off the new underground lines were often plagued by technical flaws and mechanical unreliability, further compounding the disadvantages faced by German pilots. The industrial collapse fueled a morale crisis among the civilian population and the military leadership. The promise of the Luftwaffe to protect the fatherland was now a visible lie. Every day, the citizens of Berlin and other major cities looked up to see the contrails of American bombers, often without the sight of defending German fighters. The dominance achieved by the P-51 forced the German military to recognize that the skies were irrevocably lost, directly impacting the strategic preparations for the looming Allied invasion of Western Europe. Without air cover, the Wehrmacht would be fighting blind, exposed, and vulnerable to continuous aerial attacks. The immediate ripple effect of American air dominance extended far beyond the German factory floors and into the critical preparations for Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy. General Eisenhower and the Allied planners had repeatedly stressed that the invasion could not proceed without near-total air superiority over the landing zones and the subsequent battlefield. The success of Big Week provided the final, definitive assurance that this superiority was attainable. With the Luftwaffe fighter arm decimated and its industrial capacity crippled, the Allied air forces, both the heavy strategic bombers and the shorter-range tactical fighters like the P-47 and Spitfire, could be redeployed with confidence. Instead of focusing solely on defending the bombers, the tactical air forces could now turn their full attention to softening the Reich. This involved relentless attacks on transportation networks, rail yards, bridges, marshalling points, severely limiting the German army's ability to move reinforcements to the potential invasion front. The P-51s and P-47s transitioned to fighter sweeps, flying across France and Belgium, ruthlessly destroying trains, trucks, and any military movement visible from the air. This aerial destruction campaign paralyzed the German response capability weeks before D-Day. When the invasion finally commenced on June 6, 1944, the American and British air forces operated almost uncontested over the beaches. German field commanders reported the catastrophic inability to conduct effective reconnaissance, move reserves during daylight, or provide air support to their beleaguered ground troops. The strategic victory achieved over the skies of Germany in February translated directly into reduced casualties for the soldiers landing on the beaches of Normandy. The air dominance secured that day in February became the silent, massive shield protecting the Allied ground forces, ensuring that the battle for France would be decided on Allied terms, thanks to the crippling damage inflicted by the long-range strategic bombing campaign and the relentless power of the Mustang escort. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang, forged in the brutal proving grounds of Operation Argument, was so profound that it fundamentally shaped the evolution of German fighter design in the latter stages of the war. Recognizing that the Bf-109 and Fw-190, even in their most advanced variants, could no longer compete effectively against the P-51 in terms of speed, altitude performance, or range, German engineers were forced into radical, desperate measures. The overwhelming American dominance in piston-engine combat meant that the only hope for regaining control of the skies lay in revolutionary, speed-based technology, jet propulsion. This spurred the frantic, often chaotic acceleration of projects like the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was indeed a magnificent machine, capable of speeds up to 540 miles per hour, leaving the Mustang far behind in level flight. However, the American dominance over the supply chain and manufacturing process ensured that the jets arrived too late and in too few numbers to turn the tide. The very pressure applied by the P-51, forcing the Luftwaffe to jump to jet technology prematurely, created a logistical nightmare. The Me-262 was notoriously complex, demanded scarce high-quality alloys, and consumed vast quantities of the rapidly dwindling supply of specialized jet fuel. Furthermore, the jet pilots, like their piston-engine counterparts, were subjected to the attrition caused by the Mustangs. P-51 pilots quickly adapted to hunting the jets during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing, often loitering near German airfields waiting for the Me-262s to slow down for approach. Thus, the P-51's relentless, high-endurance presence ironically ensured that even the most technologically advanced German fighters could not be deployed effectively or in sufficient numbers. The victory of the Mustang was not just about winning the current fight, but about foreclosing the enemy's future technological solutions. The intensity of that defining day in February 1944 and the subsequent weeks of continuous combat settled deep into the minds of the surviving American pilots, shaping their perspectives long after the war ended. For Chet Harmon, who completed his tour and returned stateside, the memory of Big Week was not a cinematic montage of heroism, but a profound, overwhelming feeling of exhaustion and survival guilt. Years later, sitting quietly in his study, he could still taste the bitter tang of high-altitude air and hear the frantic, rhythmic chatter of the .50 caliber guns. The P-51 pilots, in particular, carried a unique psychological burden. They were the heroes who saved the bombers, yet their mission was inherently aggressive, requiring them to pursue the enemy relentlessly across vast distances, often fighting until their fuel tanks were nearly empty. They flew alone or in small pairs for hours, their lives depending entirely on their discipline, their machine, and their sheer will to survive. The weight of that decision, to push the envelope of range, to dive into a furball far from home, to leave the safety of the formation to hunt down a fleeing enemy, was immense. Many pilots reflected that the true psychological turning point wasn't the number of kills, but the realization that the German opposition, once formidable and terrifying, had become desperate and, ultimately, broken. The dominance felt absolute, but it came at a terrible moral cost, forcing young men on both sides into existential battles. When he looked back, Chet didn't celebrate the destruction. He remembered the sight of the smoking wreckage below and the momentary flash of a German pilot ejecting, a tiny human being tumbling through the emptiness. That day had defined the war, ending the air conflict swiftly and decisively, but the psychic burden of having been part of the overwhelming force, the instrument of that destruction, never fully lifted. It was the day they won the skies, but the scars of the victory were etched permanently into the generation that flew it. The triumph of Big Week, while strategically decisive, was not without grievous cost to the 8th Air Force and the pilots who secured the air superiority. While the German losses were catastrophic, the American airmen paid a heavy toll. During the period of Operation Argument, the 8th Air Force suffered hundreds of combat casualties, men who had faced the relentless German defense and failed to return to their bases in England. Every empty bed in the barracks, every missing name on the briefing board, was a stark reminder that even in victory, the attrition was savage. The success of the P-51 was forged in the sacrifice of the bomber crews who flew the first, most dangerous waves, forcing the Germans into the sky where the Mustangs could engage them. The bomber formations acted as the bait, the large, slow-moving targets that drew the Luftwaffe into the decisive battle. The war demanded a terrible exchange rate. The destruction of irreplaceable German veteran pilots and machines cost the lives of hundreds of American boys, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, who simply vanished over the snow-covered fields of Germany. Years later, on visits to the American military cemeteries scattered across Europe, the rows of white crosses stand as quiet, solemn testaments to this cost. These graves mark not only the price of bombing a factory or destroying an oil refinery, but the price of securing the fundamental military condition necessary for winning the entire war: air superiority. The victory of that defining day was comprehensive, but its memory is forever infused with the somber knowledge of the airmen who flew their last mission to make it happen, their sacrifice ensuring that all subsequent Allied operations, from D-Day to the final crossing of the Rhine, would benefit from a sky cleared of overwhelming enemy resistance. The defining day of American air dominance, the realization of the P-51's long-range strategic power during Operation Argument, stands as a watershed moment in military history, permanently changing how air power was perceived and deployed. Before this day, strategic bombing was a blunt, often self-defeating instrument, limited by the range of its protective fighters. After, it became the decisive, war-ending force. The successful deep penetration escort strategy allowed the Allies to transition seamlessly into the pre-invasion bombing campaign, systematically destroying the infrastructure of the Third Reich. This strategic air superiority proved that the dominance of the air could be achieved and maintained, regardless of the distance from the home base. The lesson was learned globally. No future conflict could be won without first securing and maintaining absolute control of the airspace. The American industrial genius, epitomized by the mass production of the reliable, high-performance Mustang and the formidable Flying Fortress, had overwhelmed the sophisticated but supply-starved German technological base. This victory in the air campaign, secured at such a high cost in February 1944, ensured that the ground war that followed was almost a mop-up operation by comparison. The ultimate result of the P-51's endurance was the acceleration of victory, saving countless lives on the ground by crippling the enemy's capacity to fight. The skies over Europe belonged irrevocably to the Allies. If this story, charting the terrifying vulnerability, the technological breakthrough, and the ultimate decisive dominance of the American Air Forces in World War II, touched your heart and gave you a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made high above the earth, please consider subscribing to WWII Lore and join us as we continue to explore the legendary aircraft and heroic pilots who secured victory in the air. The immediate impact of the successful deep penetration strikes continued into the subsequent days of Big Week, relentlessly hammering the German aircraft industry. The bombers returned, day after day, finding the opposition weaker and more disorganized with each sortie. The intensity of the attacks forced the Luftwaffe to scramble fighters from bases far to the south and east, burning precious fuel and exhausting pilots simply to reposition. This constant harassment was a form of combat by logistics. By forcing the Germans to fly constantly, the American air effort was forcing their aircraft to exceed maintenance schedules and consume irreplaceable resources. The initial wave of attacks had focused on the assembly plants, aiming to stop the flow of new airframes. The follow-up missions systematically targeted the component manufacturers, the companies producing landing gear, hydraulic systems, and the crucial precision instruments required for combat flight. Without these complex components, the remaining airframe factories, even those moved underground, became useless. Chet Harmon, flying several more missions during that critical week, noted the distinct change in the character of the German defense. The head-on, aggressive passes of the veteran fighter pilots had been replaced by cautious, tentative probes, often breaking off the moment the silvery Mustangs were spotted. The confidence was gone. The strategic planners in England knew they had achieved a critical mass of destruction. They had crossed the threshold where German replacement capability was exceeded by the rate of American destruction. The sky was no longer a battleground. It was becoming a highway for American air power, leading directly to the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The consistent deployment of the P-51, capable of flying further and fighting longer, had fundamentally altered the operational risk profile. Bomber losses, while never zero, began a steady decline, while the verified fighter kills continued to mount, signaling the inevitable collapse of the enemy's air defense system and cementing the absolute dominance achieved that week, marking the definitive moment where the strategic air war became a foregone conclusion, merely awaiting its final chapter to be written in fire and steel across the German landscape.